So I will basically like to go to the next slide. Just press here.
Okay, good. All right. It's not going to run out of steam or.
Yeah, it sounds a bit extreme.
It's always a tribal affair.
But I mean,
So Isabel sits between us so we don't come to blows. We're frequent co-authors, so we can handle it. The question is whether we're going to repeat each other or welcome yourself.
all right, that's quite a loaded.
Okay, so let us get started. Carly, if you could maybe close the door. Okay, so thank you so much for coming at the end of a really busy semester. So my name, I'm just going to introduce the speakers. My name is Isabela. I am a professor of political science here, and I'm also directing the European Union Center that we have here. I have previously worked on Hungary and Romania on electoral irregularities not so long ago, and so it gives me a great pleasure to welcome our two speakers today. So we have Professor Laurent Pech, professor of law at the University College Dublin, and also, as he will discuss, sort of a member of a research project on the rule of law in Europe, and also a visiting professor at CU Vienna. And we have Professor Scheppele, Lawrence Rockefeller Professor of Sociology at Princeton University. It is great to welcome Professor Scheppele here, who sort of is a leading expert on backsliding in general, on European law and backsliding, and sort of has brought the Hungarian case to kind of to our, collective sort of.
Although you were living there at the time, you knew it.
So thank you so much. So and we also want this is a joint event co-sponsored with the law school. We really are grateful for this. And if you want to say more about the upcoming events, maybe, or just so that we can kind of.
We will have many great events coming in the second semester, but not all the speakers are confirmed. So I can already confirm that we will have an event on migration, geopolitics, and more like the transformation of Europe. But the dates they still need to be set. So just stay tuned.
So I will start with
Isabela.
Okay. Oh. Yes. Okay. Great. Thanks so much. Oh, yes.
Okay. The forward. Okay. Great. Wonderful. So first of all, thank you for the warm welcome. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces in the room. There are actually a lot of people in the room who are more than just the footnotes of my talk, but I will call them out and you can wave when I mention your name, because there's actually a group of us that have been working on this similar problem. And I'm going to talk about just one phase of what's happening in Europe, which is what I call Europe's new democracy deficit. So yes, you will hear about Hungary because I can't avoid it, but Hungary is a kind of subtext in a bigger story about some things that are happening in the EU. So let me start by saying that when we think about the EU, Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union lays out the values on which the EU is based. And let me just mention something about the slides. My slides will sometimes be even wordier than I am, which is actually the reverse of what you're supposed to do. But the reason for doing it is that when I'm talking to audiences of very different levels of knowledge about the EU, I'll keep my oral comments kind of general in case you don't know much. But the slides may tell you more, and you're always welcome to just write to me and get the slides because they're meant also to be kind of standalone. So this is the article from the founding treaty of the EU, which lays out the values that Europe is supposed to stand for. And if you asked anyone 10 years ago whether this was actually real law, which is to say, could you actually cite it in a brief to a court? The answer was no. I did suggest it 10 years ago and was laughed at. Dmitry Tukoshinov, who's here. I'm just pointing out my team of people. We all worked on this. When I mentioned it 10 years ago, people said, "Oh, she just doesn't know any EU law." Okay, and now here we are. Sort of 13 years later, where the court has actually endorsed that this is actually the kind of law that you can actually enforce. So I'm going to talk to you about that. What the EU has been doing, though, this was the set of values, but the EU, from its founding, always had what gets called in the EU literature a democracy deficit. And this is just a kind of fantastical map of the EU institutions. And what they meant by a democracy deficit was that at least when the EU, the predecessor organizations of the EU were founded, none of them were elected at the beginning. And if democracy has something to do with elections, then the EU looked like it was suffering from a democratic deficit. That said, there's been improvement in the treaties over the years. So now the European Parliament is actually directly elected. And by the way, there is an election coming up in June. And I'm looking at the Our Rule of Law team in the back of a group of fabulous students who are going to be leading the charge on getting out first-time voters to vote in next June's election. So talk to you should wave your hands. So those are the people working on that campaign there. So the Parliament is directly elected. But the European Commission, which is kind of the nerve center of the EU and the EU's executive, is not directly elected. And the Council of Ministers, which is the other lawmaking body, kind of like a Senate, upper chamber, where the states are represented as states, send members from their states, but the council is not directly elected at EU level. So the old argument was there's a democracy deficit because the institutions themselves are not directly responsible to any kind of European public. And then there was a nifty solution proposed both in the literature and I think really in the general discussions about Europe that said, well, look, you know, in most democratic systems, it's quite unusual to have every single body of state be elected. So in prime ministerial systems, you don't directly vote for the prime minister, right? The prime minister is elected by a parliament. And here you've got a system of all these democratic states, and they elect their governments, and then their governments are represented in the council. Their governments appoint people to the commission. Now there's even a little more democracy because the parliament can refuse the composition of the commission at the outset of the mandate. And so, you know, the democracy deficit was solved because the EU was indirectly democratic because the member states were democratic. Okay, and then some things happened. So this is just, you probably don't know if you can see this, but the yellow line is probably the one to look at. So this is from Freedom House's Nations in Transit report. So it covers a lot of the former Soviet bloc states. And the yellow line is the one I'm going to talk about today. That's Hungary. And these are the scores on, you know, like how democratic are you? This starts in 2010, which is when Viktor Orban's government came to power in Hungary, and it ends in 2020. By that time, Hungary had gone from being pretty well entrenched in the category of consolidated democracies, fallen through the category of semi-consolidated democracies, and had become a hybrid regime by virtually all the democracy raters by 2019, 20, it depended on exactly when they did the measures. But I think pretty much everybody agrees that Hungary is no longer not only a robust democracy, but a democracy. In the meantime, the Polish government that was elected in 2015 set its country also on a kind of catastrophic course. That's the kind of light blue line, the second one down from the top. And you can see it's 2015 and it starts to go down. We've just had this new election in Poland where we hope there'll be a kind of turnaround, although there's some interesting questions about how you turn things around after they've gotten that bad. But the government in Poland had gone from being a consolidated to a semi-consolidated democracy. And again, trouble. So here's now the general question. If the EU is democratic because it leans on the fact that there are democratic member states, what happens if you can't count on the member states themselves being democratic? And that's what I'm calling the new democracy deficit. And in many ways, it's more threatening to the European project than simply having, you know, a few non-compliant states with this or that aspect of EU law, because the whole legitimacy of the EU depends on the member states being democratic. So the question is, what can the EU do about this? And this is my focus for today. Okay, so Poland is fortunately in slightly better shape than that cartoon shows itself as being. But autocracy is now quite dug in Hungary, and in Poland, it's still dug in. Remember, there was an election in October, but the new government has not yet taken office. And some of us are watching very carefully because there's still shenanigans that could happen before the new government takes office. We hope next week, but it hasn't happened yet. So Poland is sort of on the margins here because we're not certain it's going to make the transition. All right, so the question is, like, didn't the EU think this might happen? And the answer is, well, actually, it did start to plan for this. In the treaty revisions that happened in the 1990s, when a lot of the post-communist states were starting to line up for membership, the EU started putting in its successive wave of treaty amendments, a provision that now is called Article 7 of the Treaty on European Union. It actually went together in a couple of pieces. And I just summarize it here. The idea was that if a state is going rogue, then Part 1 of Article TEU says, if other states see that a member state is in danger, excuse me, of breaching the values of Article 2, then it can issue a warning. Kind of assuming it's like, oh, you're going over the dividing line, driving down the road, maybe you should pull over at a rest stop and kind of rest, and assuming they would do it if you warn them. It's Article 7.1, no sanctions attached. Then there's a totally separate process that could be launched without going through Article 7.1, excuse me, and that is Article 7.2, which says if values are actually being breached, if these Article 2 values are being breached, then 2/3 of the Parliament plus a unanimous European Council, and the European Council is all the heads of state meeting. So like all the other member states have to agree, here's a state in trouble. They can vote that there's been a breach of values. And then once that happens, Part 3 kicks in and it goes back to the Council of Ministers for a determination of what sanctions should follow. And that can include removing the vote of the offending state in the Council of Ministers. It can include funding cuts. It could include a bunch of things. Okay, the problem is that for much of the time that Hungary has been going down the tubes, so has Poland. And if you needed unanimous agreement, they made a pact early on that each would veto the use of Article 7.2 against the other. So until this recent election, for the last 8 years, this mechanism has been blocked at European level. So it was impossible to use, and that was even assuming all the non-rogue states, which kind of go in and out of having far-right parties in their coalitions and, you know, trying to appeal to voters who are Eurosceptics. And I mean, anyway, it was too high a hurdle to use. So let me just tell you like 2 minutes about Hungary, because in case you haven't been following it, it's even worse than you think. Isabel knows this, and I will cite her in a minute. So let me just summarize, like, what, so this is, whenever I talk about this, people say, oh, you just don't like Viktor Orban. And the answer is actually, no, I used to know him, and he could be quite charming back in the 90s when I knew him. So the problem isn't, and yes, I'm not a conservative, but government, you know, people are entitled to elect conservative governments. So this is not the point, right? The question for me is, a government is no longer democratic when you can no longer change the government by elections. We might add some more things to that, but that at a minimum. And so what happened? Well, when Orban was elected in 2010, he changed all the rules. He gave a speech at CPAC last summer, the American Conservative Committee that met in Budapest, and he said, lesson 1 is don't play by their rules. So he changed everything. He rewrote the Constitution. Thousands of pages of laws were shoveled through the parliament that nobody, including the people who voted for them, could read. Captured the Constitutional Court in the first 3 years by expanding the number of judges and changing the way they were appointed. Has been attacking the judiciary and undermining its independence ever since. Every single independent office in the country, from the prosecutor to the audit office, to the Electoral Commission, to the National Bank, all captured in various different ways. They've been attacking civil society organizations. In fact, there's a law going through the parliament this week that will ban all foreign funding to any political entities, including NGOs in Hungary, just in time for the EU elections. They've, of course, driven Central European University out of the country, and now they've attacked the independence of all but 4 of the other institutions in Hungary by privatizing them and turning them over to political allies. The media is an echo chamber for Orban. There's a few little independent media sites, but they're hard to find and they're really under constant threat. Orban has launched various xenophobic, anti-Roma, anti-migrant, anti-Semitic, and anti-EU mass campaigns, including one going on now. Massive corruption financed by EU funds, and then rigging of elections. And since my argument here is about, Laurent's going to talk about the rule of law crisis, which is really what the EU started to call this problem when it was mostly about attacking the judiciary. But I'm going to focus more on the democracy side of this. So therefore, the question is, what's gone wrong with Hungarian democracy? Again, I don't know if you can see in the back of the room, but this is a chart showing Orban's popularity. Fidesz, the political party, is always in orange. The crucial thing to see here, this goes from 2010 when Orban was first elected up to 2018. I could bring it up to the present, but it shows more or less the same pattern. Orban's and his party's popularity is typically between 30 and 40%. He almost never gets higher than that. And so how does this work? It's about the same level, by the way, that Trump has with his base of support. So the question is how you get from that base of support, which isn't enough to win, to capture a national government. How do you get from there to the point when you can capture a government? So, and the answer is the elections are rigged, okay? So Orban changes all the rules about elections. So starting in 2004, the Hungarian parliament is organized along the same model as the German parliament, where a little more than half the seats are single member constituencies and the other half are party list seats. So when you go to vote in Hungary, you've got 2 votes, one for your individual representative. That's a first past the post election, and the other is for a party. And then the sum total of representatives of the parliament are a combination of those 2 votes. So before Orban came to power in those first past the post districts, there was always a second round runoff. So you'd have 7 candidates in the first round, and then it would be a runoff of 2. So you would have coalitions that would form after you had a vote. Orban eliminated the second round runoff. So you can win if you've got 7 parties with 25% of the vote if everybody gets less than you do. Okay, so that was the first thing. The second was that Orban, within a week of taking office, announced actually the opposition parties didn't think this was a bad idea until they saw where it led. The parliament's too big, we should cut the number of seats in half. And people said, great, it's cheaper, we don't have, whatever. So they cut the number of seats in half, and that meant that Orban got to redo all the districts, redo all the districts. And the districts are fiercely gerrymandered, so that in 2014, Orban got 45% of the vote, his party got 45% of the vote, they won 91% of the districts. In 2018, 49% of the vote, they got 89% of the districts. Last year, 54% of the vote, 83% of the districts. The composition was catching on to sort of how you win in the system like this, but even so, completely disproportionate in the single member districts. And part of that is because the district sizes vary up to 35%. This would be unconstitutional if this were in the US. It's bad practice as far as most election monitors are concerned, but that's how Orban did it. And then last year, when he was worried about losing the election, suddenly they legalized what the Hungarians call voter tourism, which is you could suddenly register as a Hungarian in any district you wanted to. And that meant that Orban could give up the Budapest districts where he knew he was going to lose and move all of his voters into the close districts, and so that he could win them. That was how, even though the opposition unified on put up 1 candidate against Orban's candidate in every district, Orban still won all the districts because he could move his voters last year. Okay, so that's just the single member districts. And then I'm going to get to your trick soon. Okay, and then there's the other, Isabel has documented some great stuff on these elections. So that's with the single member districts. Then there's like, what do you do with the party list votes? And if you know the German election system, you'll know that the German election system has been nothing if not obsessive about trying to ensure, charmingly obsessive, about trying to ensure that the I see our German friends smiling about, the controversy over this, right? So the German system requires that the final proportion of representation across parties in the parliament represent the distribution of votes in the electorate as a whole. And the problem has been in Germany, actually, that the CDU was getting too many votes for a long time. So they had to keep adding extra seats to the parliament to get the other seats up to, anyway, overhang mandates, ask me afterwards. So the German system's been fixed, but in the Hungarian system, they did the opposite. When they actually try to add up the votes from the party lists, they not only don't compensate for the single member districts where there are votes lost, like the second place candidate doesn't get a seat in the parliament. They don't try to compensate, they do the opposite. They actually compensate the winners in each of the districts, which added 6, 7, 8 seats to Orban's majority each time since they put the system into place. They've also rigged the system so that Hungarians who have left the country because of Orban's policies have a really hard time voting back in the country at all. And then they did this thing to great acclaim from the Council of Europe until the Council of Europe figured out what it was about, and the European Court of Human Rights has just struck it down as violative of the anti-discrimination clause. there's a set of ethnic minority lists. So you can register to vote as a Roma, as a German, as a Armenian from my district. And then it would turn out that Fidesz captured all those lists so that all the minority lists resulted in another person going to the Fidesz column. So all those things are what happened to the party list votes. And then there's just nonsense, right? So they control all the media. So the opposition candidate in the parliamentary election last year got 15 minutes on a Wednesday morning when the rest of the time was all government party. The government and the party are so intermeshed that the government just spends endless money on stuff which they claim is not for the campaign, but just promoting government policies, which turn out to be exactly the policies that the governing party is promoting. And then this is the part where Isabel comes in. So, you know, the Hungarians created this kind of workfare program. Instead of welfare, you don't get any kind of social benefits as a matter of right. You have to work for this money. And then in exchange, you're pressured into voting for the candidate. And Isabel did this amazing experiment where she could find out exactly how people were coerced without asking them how they were coerced. It was just like a model of political science methodology, and showed that exactly the people who are now overwhelmingly on these no longer welfare rolls are really pressured to vote for the government to keep their benefits. Thank you, Isabel. And then there's this massive suppression kind of the expat vote. Anyway, so all of that is just to say the elections are massively rigged, not just one way, not just two ways, but about 12 different ways. And the end result is that no matter how the opposition organizes itself, it cannot win. Even though Orban's base of support is actually not big enough by itself for him to win the election. So he gets 30%. Then he gets another 25% through rigging, and that's how he's been able to win. So the Varieties of Democracy Project in 2020 said, the EU now has its first non-democratic member state, right? And then the European Parliament voted last year in this resolution that passed by, more than 2/3. The resolution said, quote, "There is increasing consensus among experts that Hungary is no longer a democracy," that from the European Parliament. Okay, so when I say Hungary is not a democracy, I'm not just saying I don't like Orban, right? Or that I don't like his policies or whatever. This is just that there's a structural fix and nobody else can win these elections, okay? So now, back to the EU democracy deficit. We definitely have a country that's no longer a democracy, right? So what can the EU do to protect itself from its rogue states? Okay, so, and I think Laurent will talk about the toolkit. So the EU has been watching Hungary and with concern, all these new developments, and it says, we are worried. We are even more worried. We are very worried. It had tools it could have used. It could have brought infringement actions, which are lawsuits essentially by the Commission against member states for violating EU law. They did virtually none of them in Hungary since 2011 on these topics, on anything related to democracy and the rule of law. Then they invented a rule of law framework where they warn the state and then they explain what's wrong, and then they, and that was used. They tried it for Poland. It didn't do anything. Now they have annual reports, like naming and shaming kind of reports, but that assumes a country can be shamed. Laurent will talk more about this. Every time there was a new crisis in Hungary, they'd invent a new tool, which put off them actually doing anything at all until the tool was approved, and then they would deploy it, and then it would do nothing. Okay, Laurent will talk more about that. So finally, and this is where I'm going to turn to another of my co-authors in the room, namely John Moraine, who is here, because he and I have done a lot of this work together. Actually, we were all advocating this, Dimitri as well. I mean, the whole audience is full of plants for this lecture, okay? So what we were all trying to think of is what would actually get the Hungarian government's attention. And the answer was, as it often is with everything Orban, money. So, the Hungarian government was getting about 6% of GDP in funds from the EU. And virtually all of the new public works construction was financed by this. And Orban's way of staying in power was that he pays off his oligarchic friends, skimming off the top of this EU money. I heard somebody describe it as being like an oil curse. Those of you in the political science field will understand this. When you have, a country that's dependent on one natural resource, like all the corruption kind of, coalesces around that one resource. So in Hungary, it's EU money is that resource. And so all the corruption has kind of built up around this. So we thought, well, if you can cut the money, A, you'll get Orban's attention, and B, you might actually do something. So a lot of us have been lobbying for years that the EU should actually, we told the Commission they had the power to do it. They said, oh no, we don't really have the power to do it. So then the next thing was, well, how about if you get the power to do it? And so finally, in the last couple of years, the EU has enacted 3 different regulations that allow it to cut funds to states that are violating basic values of the EU. So there's something called the conditionality regulation, passed at the end of 2020 in a European Council meeting that was very contentious, which allows the EU to cut funds to member states if the member states risk misspending the funds due to rule of law problems. So corruption would be a big thing, or not having an independent judiciary, or having your state audit office not actually having numbers add up, or things of that kind. So that's the conditionality regulation. There's some of you may recall that there's a new fund the EU pays for itself through now called the Recovery and Resilience Fund, meant to be, started off as a COVID fund, and now it's sort of filling in the hole in the budget left behind by Brexit, which also comes with conditionality that all of the countries that get money from the Recovery and Resilience Fund have to honor what are called country-specific recommendations, which is EU speak for, oh, this is even worse, EU speak for the recommendations that come every year when the European Commission assesses every member state under something called the European semester, which is European, but it has nothing to do with semesters. It's the thing they put in place to make sure countries didn't overspend their budget after the financial crisis. And so that comes back with macroeconomic recommendations. These are called country-specific recommendations. But the Commission had been smuggling into the country-specific recommendations for Hungary and for Poland, recommendations that said, gee, we're worried about judicial independence in your country. You know, we're also worried about corruption in your country. And when they went into the country-specific recommendations, those rule of law-ish kind of problems, they suddenly became enforceable when the Recovery and Resilience Fund made all the money dependent on honoring and meeting the country-specific recommendations. And then the third regulation was something called the Common Provisions Regulation. That's something they pass with every new budget. It is an accountant's dream and everybody else's nightmare. It's like 400 pages. I don't know, John's the only one I know who's read the entire thing. That's very long, of detailed accounting standards of how you have to account for EU money. And they snuck into a provision of this when no one was looking, including those of us who were following this issue closely, something that said you have to spend all EU money in such a way that it complies with the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is like the Bill of Rights for the EU, that is a separate treaty that is now binding on all member states. So suddenly, in the space of a couple of years, the Commission gave itself, and some of this has to be done jointly with the Council, the power to cut funds to member states for violating these principles. And just exactly a year ago, I think a year ago this week, the EU suddenly announced, although actually the announcement came out the day before Christmas when no one was paying attention, so they didn't want to really call attention to it, but they suddenly announced that using these 3 things together, they were going to be cutting about 20 billion euros from Hungary, freezing. It's not cut, it's just waiting for them to improve, and 110 billion euros from Poland. The difference between them is not that one is worse than the other, but that one's bigger than the other, so they just get more money. So it's like all the money, except agricultural funds, going to both member states. And this, like, after the Commission had done nothing for a decade, this was like a big deal. Like, so Poland said, well, to hell with you, it said less politely. Hungary then does what Hungary always does. Oh, really? We'll fix our laws. And so they start this flurry of lawmaking. I can spare you the details. It looks like it complies, but it doesn't. Ask me questions. There's a lot of detail there. But the point was that they were trying to leverage concrete fixes in these things that Hungary had done. Okay. The problem is none of these conditionalities dealt at all with the democracy problem. You still have corrupt elections. You still have no way for the opposition to win. So all that handles rule of law stuff, but going back to the democratic deficit, then what? Okay, so what we're seeing now is that Hungary as a rogue state is trying to gum up the works. Now that it's not got its money, it is playing hardball. So there's going to be a meeting of the European Council next week. All the heads of state meet and do important things. Hungary has already said it's going to veto even the agenda for the meeting. It's going to veto aid to Ukraine. It's going to veto accession talks. It's going to veto getting extra money for things the European budget is running short of. It's demanding that Ursula von der Leyen not run the next time, or else they won't approve anything. And then they say, but if you give us our money, maybe we'll forget about some of these things. So in all the areas of EU policy where you need the unanimous consent of all the member states, Hungary is now saying, we're not going to play ball with any of you until you give us the money. And then what they're saying at home, I might say, is, you see, the EU is giving our money to Ukraine. They've run out of money. They want more money to give to Ukraine. And so this is how Orban whips up his anger and hostility against Ukraine. And anyway, so it's causing real problems for the EU. And it's causing real problems for the EU under what's called the sort of principle of mutual trust. So, I mean, the way the EU works is that it's a very thin layer of regulation. There are fewer employees of the European Union than of the state of Massachusetts, I once learned, maybe even fewer than the state of Connecticut. It's just a thin layer of bureaucrats making rules, and then the rules are all enforced at member state level. So how does the EU operate? It relies on the principle that every member state has endeavored to promise that it will enforce the laws made at EU level. And this principle where, you know, Spain can send one of its nationals to Hungary to stand trial for something, it assumes that the Hungarian legal system works the way the EU says it should. And that's true for everything across the board. And the principle of mutual trust basically says you can't even look under the hood to find out whether the other member state is doing it. Just assume that they are, because the commission will ensure that all is fine. Okay. So now we know the commission is not really enforcing the law. If you're in any ordinary international organization, again, to talk to the political scientists in the room who might be in IR, as you know, with international organizations, somebody breaches the rule, you're entitled to engage in self-help, right? That you get to enforce the rules or whatever. In the EU, no, because there's an enforcement mechanism. So the question is, what happens if the enforcement mechanism isn't working? You can't even trust these other countries or democracies. What can everybody do about Orban coming to the meeting and blocking everything when he's not even democratically elected, right? And so you're starting to see a breakup of certain pieces of the EU around this stuff, where we've had judges in a variety of states not send people back to Poland once its judiciary went under. We're starting to see people saying we're not going to trust Hungary on different things. So this is really a crisis for the EU. So what can be done? And I'm running out of time, so let me just stop with this final thought here. So far, we focused on rule of law, but we need, I think, now to shift to focus on democracy, because once you get a country that has gone as far as Hungary has gone, it really threatens the very integrity of the EU for it to go on like this. So here's the ray of hope. In addition to Article 2, which you've already seen, there's Article 10 of the Treaty on European Union, which says, you know, the functioning of the union shall be founded on representative democracy. Aha, well, what if you don't have it? Then look at part 2, where it says member states are represented in the European Council by their heads of state or government, and my favorite part, in the council by their governments, themselves democratically accountable either to their national parliaments or to their citizens. So maybe what this means is that you're not eligible to sit in the council if you're not a democratically elected government, if you're not democratically accountable in some way. Because you're thinking, can the EU enforce that? Really? Did they mean that? And the answer is actually the Court of Justice, which is, by the way, flashing red on this. We so far haven't talked about the Court of Justice, but it saw this coming from a long way off. And it's been handing everybody the law that they can use to fix these problems. So it started in 2019, as you know, again, this is right when Hungary is being declared not a democracy by all the democracy rating agencies. Here's a case that's a totally different topic, but it starts to say, we're going to think that democracy is enforceable if you combine Article 10 with Article 2. Okay, we can do the technical version for the lawyers in the room later, but you know, and there's more on the slides that I'm going to be able to explain. But this is basically inviting cases that say, you know, we're going to be able to enforce this. So how are we going to do this? So there's a couple cases, way too much on the slide here, but you've all, you know, known that actually, if you've been following the new Spanish government, which took the Basque separatist parties into the government on the condition that they get an amnesty. Before that, they were trying to kill them all or arrest them all or whatever, and they were interfering with the results of the European election. So there's actually a couple of good cases, I mean, good from the standpoint of legal development out of the Catalonian mess, where the Court of Justice was saying, look, democracy at EU level has to be enforced at EU level. Right, and the member states can't get in the way of the enforcement of democracy at EU level. There's 2 cases cited here that say that. So you see the court is kind of developing all of this. And then I mentioned the conditionality regulation under which funds are being frozen to Hungary now. The Hungarians, of course, then challenged whether this was really legal for them to do that. In the big decision where both Poland and Hungary challenged the conditionality regulation, The commission came out with a lot of language, of which this stuff in red is very typical, where they said the values contained in Article 2, and by this they mean all the values, right? Not just rule of law, but that includes democracy and human rights. The values contained in Article 2 define the very identity of the European Union as a common legal order. Thus, the European Union must be able to defend those values within the limits of its powers, etc. Once the democracy in the member states spread as a problem to the EU institutions, this sounds a bit like what the court is now inviting some litigation on. So here's our present crisis, and I will end on this note, and I will cite some work in the room by John Marijn in his capacity as a member of something called the Myers Commission in the Netherlands, which is an NGO that advises the Dutch government on its obligations, particularly under European law. We have this problem. So some of you have heard of the rotating presidency of the EU. Okay? It's basically member states rotate at 6-month intervals, and who gets to chair all the meetings of the Council of Ministers? Here's the list of, who's coming up, who's been, who's coming. And you will see that Hungary is there. Hungary will hold the rotating presidency of the Council of Ministers from July through December of next year. A non-democratic country at the helm of this. Can we do something about this? So what does the rotating presidency do? Well, I'm getting all this from the report that John was the principal author for the Myers Committee in the Netherlands. The tasks of the presidency are to plan meetings, set the agendas, negotiate among states if there's disagreement on issues, to represent the council, a bunch of things. Having your black sheep be the representative of the council is not conducive to any of this. The European Parliament saw this coming, sorry for the very wordy slide. They had a resolution in June that said, if the council doesn't do something about this with the Hungarians coming up, we will do something about it. I love that we recall that the parliament could take appropriate measures if such a solution, like getting Hungary out of the chair, is not found. Okay, so the parliament has set this up as kind of a challenge. So can the EU do anything about it? So John's committee uncovered the fact that actually multiple times in the past, the council has in fact voted to change the rotation. When new states are admitted, they add states. For Brexit, remember Brexit, Britain dropped out of holding the rotating presidency. Sometimes countries say, wait a second, we've got an election coming up. Can we move? So a QMV, a qualified majority vote, which I have a little footnote here, is 55% of the states with 65% of the people. A QMV vote of the council can change the order. So they have the power to do it, right? But they can't say Hungary can never hold the rotating presidency because it's in the treaties that every state gets to be in rotation, but they can put them at the end of the queue, for example. They could do that. Probably too late. And so, what we really need for long-term is a proposal that says there must be some conditions that your state meets before you can hold the rotating presidency. Like you shouldn't be under Article 7 monitoring. You shouldn't be, rated a non-democracy by other, entities. So, this is something. But the genius of the Myers Commission report was to say, well, look, the rotating presidency, it's not like July 1st, Hungary is doing it by itself. Instead, and I'll just go back to this slide, if you'll see there are these lines, so there's 3 countries in a line and 3 countries in a line. These are called troikas. It turns out that when the rotating presidencies are being planned, 3 states plan them together, and it's the states between the lines. So Hungary is the last of a troika that includes Spain and Belgium. And together they're supposed to plan. So Belgium and Spain could try to negotiate with Hungary, or could babysit Hungary, or could try to interfere with what Hungary is going to do by at least not allowing Hungary to chair the sessions where topics involving it come up, or where it's the lone wolf not agreeing to anything, or something of that kind. Partially transferring responsibilities among Troika members would be the way to handle it without going to something as drastic as putting Hungary at the back of the queue. But they could put Hungary at the back of the queue still, and they could, for the long run, formally change the qualifications, because this may not be the only time it happens. And so, close with this, autocracies inside the EU are not just a problem for those states, but they're creating problems for the rest of the EU. And the EU has not really thought about how to handle that. The Myers Committee report, I think, has done a really good job of it. we're back to, these are, by the way, if you go behind the European Parliament in Brussels, you will see these statues of ostriches. It is so appropriate, but it's in the wrong place. The Parliament has been very brave on this stuff. They need to move it over by the Commission, which is the one that is constantly acting like this. So it's really a matter of political will. Like, will they actually do something? And the answer is, it's a crisis. It really, the future of the EU depends on it, and it's not the end. And I will stop there. Thanks. Sure. Good. Great, thank you.
So, thank you very much, Kim, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak this evening about the future of the rule of law in the EU. Before I tell you about the future of the rule of law in the EU or in EU law, I think it's important to briefly outline the history of the rule of law in the EU legal framework. And essentially, when it comes to the history of the rule of law in EU law, I think we can distinguish between two phases. The first phase is essentially has been ongoing since the early 90s to culminate with the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty in 2007. And essentially, this first phase, or what I have described as the first phase in the history of the rule of law in EU law, has been a gradual process of entrenchment and formal enshrinement of the rule of law in the EU treaties. I'm not going to spend much time this evening on this historical codification, essentially, of the rule of law in the EU treaty framework, because it has been well explained elsewhere, and essentially it's actually rather straightforward and possibly not really interesting considering the topics we have to discuss. Kim has mentioned actually the second phase, which essentially started, I would say, in 2010 with Hungary becoming a problematic country, or as Kim put it, a rogue state. So this, starting in 2010 with Hungary's descent into authoritarianism, a new phase in the history of EU law began, which I'm going to describe this evening as the toolbox decade. So essentially, I'm going to explain that since 2010, up to essentially, actually, it's more than 10 years technically, but the toolbox really began growing in 2012. So actually, I'm going to argue this evening that this toolbox decade has come to an end. And we might be entering into a third phase, which I'm going to describe just for the sake of argument as the retrenchment phase. So we started with entrenchment, we're going to finish with retrenchment. This is a tentative forecast, obviously. So as I said, I'm not going to spend much time on treaty enshrinement phase one, but I think it's important I tell you a bit more about phase two, the toolbox decade, because it's based on what I'm going to describe that I'm essentially going to forecast what's going to possibly happen starting soon. So the toolbox decade essentially started with the EU being confronted with something which was not expected, which the EU actors initially described as a rule of law crisis, and exhibit A in this crisis was Orban's Hungary. And technically speaking, the first formal acknowledgement that the EU was facing a new type of threat to the democratic and rule of law fabric of EU member states was acknowledged for the very first time in 2012. And this is essentially when possibly the EU failed to deal with the problem because it misdiagnosed the solution to the problem. In fact, to a large extent, it did not even understand the problem in those days. But essentially, I think Barroso, the president of the Commission and Princeton faculty member now, rightly, essentially identify at least a new type of threat. So authoritarianism was not used as a concept in those days, but we knew that something new was happening, something unprecedented and something unexpected. That essentially what I have described with Kim as rule of law backsliding, but we can call it democratic and rule of law backsliding. Usually, as Kim said, when the rule of law is being attacked, the end game is actually to rig the next election. So essentially you have a de facto one-party state, which cannot anymore be challenged through elections, which are no longer free and fair, or if they are free, they are structurally unfair. So 2012 was essentially what I would call the beginning of the toolbox decade. And the this was based on essentially a misdiagnosis by President Barroso to a large extent. He got the new type of right, but the solution to it was possibly misguided to the extent that he made the diagnosis or the following diagnosis that the EU did not have the right tools to deal with this new type of threat. So the solution was to, according to the President of the European Commission in those days, that we needed new tools. And essentially what began with the search for new tools, I would say, has taken us up to 2011. So I'm going to make the argument that the toolbox decade ended with the adoption of some of the instruments already mentioned by Kim, and essentially, to mention a few, the so-called, it's a bit technical, so you can ask me, I mean, we can discuss this, but I don't want to bore you to death with the technical details, but the adoption of the so-called recovery facility. So essentially, there was a new mechanism to give access to a lot of EU recovery money. And at the same time, there was a new mechanism described by Kim already as a so-called enabling condition relating to the EU Charter. So to make it simple, essentially, to gain access to another pot of EU money, you needed to prove compliance with the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, the EU Bill of Rights, which does include plenty of rule of law standards, legally binding rule of law standards. So this is the toolbox decade from my point of view. So, but let me perhaps give you more examples why this can be labeled as such. And perhaps before I do go through some of the instruments, I cannot even, there's so many tools which have been essentially established and previous tools which have been essentially reinvented. It would take me a few hours just to go through all the tools. But in short, essentially, we have seen the EU spending about a decade just playing with the toolbox and not even using the new tools in the right in a forceful and prompt manner. But initially, it was even worse. And in fact, people have forgotten that at the start, essentially, not only the toolbox that exist was wrong, but the EU institutions spent a lot of time fighting one another, even though this has been forgotten by now. But the Council initially, the EU body representing the national governments, did not want the supranational institutions such as the Commission and the Parliament to play a meaningful role when it comes to monitoring and enforcing compliance with rule of law requirements. And initially, it took a while before the Council adjusted its stance regarding the importance of actually enforcing rule of law standards at member state levels. But this was not widely accepted, I would argue, until the parliamentary elections of 2019. So can you imagine a lot of time was wasted just to understand that this problem actually needed cooperation between all the EU institutions and especially the institution representing the national governments. By 2019, however, some progress was made to the extent that everyone or the key EU actors agreed that essentially rule of law compliance at member state level was an issue. And more interestingly, this issue actually gained political salience. So it became actually a topic in the electoral campaign in many member states for the very first time. So by then, essentially, everyone agreed that something needed to be done, which does explain to some extent the acceleration in the adoption of new tools, such as the one I have just mentioned. But I'm not going to go through the toolbox, but essentially, if we go back to 2012, this was followed by the first tool in 2013, known as the EU Justice Scoreboard. So instead of essentially dealing forcefully with the situation in Hungary, the Commission, the first tool he adopted was essentially an annual report where you get a lot of stats and data about the functioning of national justice systems. But this was deeply misguided to the extent that you can have a very efficient judicial system in a dictatorship. I mean, I'm obviously exaggerating, but you get the picture. So essentially, the EU Justice Scoreboard served no meaningful purpose in terms of dealing with democratic and rule of law backsliding. 2014, another tool was adopted, the so-called EU Rule of Law Framework, another tool adopted by the Commission. And this time, to some extent, it was also misguided, you could argue. And in fact, there was an argument made with Professor Kochanov from an early stage. This mechanism was based on the idea that you can actually dialogue with autocrats and convince them to stop violating democracy and the rule of law. So it was kind of a discursive-based approach to solving democratic and rule of law backsliding, as if it was happening by chance, that they didn't know what they were doing, and then they would reverse course as soon as you enter into some sort of a structured good faith dialogue. It didn't obviously work and was not, in fact, even used in respect of Hungary. The Commission has always refused to use this dialogue-based mechanism in respect of Hungary. It was only used in respect of Poland. Then not much actually was done for a few years, and then we're moving to 2020. And then we have another kind of, this time, not a dialogue-based mechanism, but a report-based mechanism, actually mentioned by Kima as well, the so-called European rule of law cycle. So essentially, you get rule of law reports now published every year about the situation in each country with a transversal report. But then again, this is not binding, does not lead to any binding consequences, and you cannot adopt direct sanctions on the basis of these reports. There was, however, the same year, an enforcement tool, which was possibly on paper at least possibly effective, the rule of law conditionality regulation. But then again, what could have been a very effective tool was actually kind of rendered very difficult to use by the council, the body representing the national government. So it's like always, there is a kind of a schizophrenic attitude in the council. I mean, essentially every EU institution is actually divided when it comes to the rule of law now. But every time you seem to be making progress in terms of adopting actually what could be potentially an effective tool, then the council backtracks for a number of reasons I don't have time to get into. And then 2021, new tools of a financial budgetary nature already mentioned. So a lot of time, to long story short, a lot of time has been spent adopting new tools, and a lot of time has been spent reinventing tools which were not aimed to be used in a rule of law backsliding context. I don't really have the time to go through the non-rule of law tools which were adjusted to actually help with rule of law backsliding. But most of these tools essentially do not lead to, again, binding consequences or binding sanctions of any nature. So essentially, this is why I have described the period between 2012 and 2021-22 as a toolbox decade. A lot of time, most of the time spent on inventing new tools or discussing, debating, or pre-2010 tools can be better used. So essentially, just to be very informal, a lot of time was wasted. And for what outcome? You look at the situation now, it's worse than ever. I mean, Kim focused on the situation in Hungary, but also perhaps to give you a striking example. 2012, the EU won the Nobel Prize for promoting democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. 2022, you look at the VDEM Varieties of Democracy annual report, and the top two most autocratizing countries in the world, Poland and Hungary. 2012, Nobel Prize. 2022, the EU is hosting the two countries which have backslided the most in the world. Doesn't mean these are the worst dictatorships in the world. It means that if you take 2012 as a starting point, and 2022 as your ending point in the world, these two countries have essentially backslided the most in the world. It gets even worse if you look at the situation post-2022, according to the same research institute. Actually, in 2023, this VDEM annual democracy report identified a wave of democratization, of autocratization, not democratization, in the EU, with additional EU member states mentioned. I'm not going to go through all of them, but Slovakia, Slovenia could be mentioned. And actually, the worst backsliding country for the last 3 years has been identified as Greece. How many infringement actions, how many sanctions adopted in respect of Greece? 0. So it's very easy. In this context, so the toolbox decade has led to no effective or no positive outcome in terms of correcting the backsliding, at least. This has led to unprecedented warnings from the top senior judges. I'm not going to go through all the warnings, but I think I'm just going to mention some of them just to understand, or at least make the point that judges are extremely worried about this trend and they are very much concerned about the lack of effectiveness or resolve from the EU political institutions, and mostly the Commission and the Council when it comes to rule of law backsliding. You have the President of the Court of Justice who made in a special issue of the Columbia Journal of European Law, in which you have possibly the most comprehensive piece ever on rule of law backsliding in EU law by Kim, I think about 125 page long. So worth every minute of the reading. But then in the same issue, you have an article by the sitting President of the Court of Justice, in which he is explicitly warning about the EU's failure to deal with authoritarian drifts in the EU. This was the first article ever where I've seen President Lennartz actually speaking explicitly of authoritarian developments and authoritarian drifts without obviously mentioning any specific member states. But this is quite a blunt warning to be made by a sitting judge of the top EU court. Never before. 2 years before, he had already warned EU institutions about the very survival of the EU project being at stake because of the failure to actually meaningfully and forcefully address rule of law backsliding. What is interesting, possibly, is that the same warnings have since been made by the two presidents, the former and the current presidents, the current president of the European Court of Human Rights. The former president of the European Court of Human Rights, a different court, which nothing to do with the EU Court of Justice. Again, in an extrajudicial statement, warned about that Europe was facing the risk of seeing the rule of law disappearing. So that's quite a strong statement for a sitting senior judge. And the current president of the European Court of Human Rights, Shifra O'Leary, a UCD law graduate, she, for the first time, mentioned instances of democratic erosion in previously stable democracies and used the concept of rule of law backsliding. So as a warning that, we're celebrating the 70th anniversary of the European Convention on Human Rights, and the European Convention on Human Rights, is under threat, according to the President of the European Court of Human Rights. Most recently, actually, this is in a draft report from the European Parliament. It's not been adopted, but I found this expression striking. This is the first time I came across an official, soon to be adopted report by actually Dutch MEP Sophie in 't Veld, where she mentions the risk of seeing the EU evolving into a lawless zone. So President Lennartz spoke about the risk of seeing the rule of law replaced with a rule of lawlessness, and how now we have the Parliament essentially raising the alarm. We are, according to this MEP in charge of this report, we are seeing the evolution. We are seeing signs of the EU evolving into a lawless zone. Essentially, what does she mean? Essentially, by that, we have increasing open, defiant violations of EU law, and in particular, from a rule of law point of view, what is particularly worrying is that we have increasing open, unashamed violation of the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights and the rulings of the European Court of Justice. This is new. This is only emerging more strongly in the past 2 or 3 years. And usually in the countries where authorities are simply disregarding, violating judgments from the European courts, they also normally have not shy about violating domestic judgments. So usually the two come together. Now, my main point is to be made at this stage is that it didn't have to be that way. A lot could have been done in a better, more decisive way if the EU Commission and the Council had listened to the European Parliament in 2012-13, when we had this Tavares report. Essentially, the European Parliament clearly, quickly, and accurately identified the main problem in Hungary. So I identified the autocratization in Hungary, only to see the Council and the Commission refusing to accept this diagnosis. And in fact, because of the wrong diagnosis made by the Commission and the Council, they spent a few years adopting tools which would be of no use when dealing with the deliberate dismantlement of checks and balances. There has been some, in the past year, there has been some unexpected bold moves when it comes to actually mostly the freezing of EU funds. But I would argue this possibly are the first and the last essentially meaningful actions we can expect from the EU. At the same time, even though there were some bold moves, if you look at the situation for the past 10 years, it has been essentially a total lack of enforcement until it was too late. Kim mentioned essentially infringement actions, but essentially, just to be very quick, the Commission is supposed to be the guardian of the treaties, and one of the main tools is the Commission has always had available to itself was the launch of legal actions, so-called infringement actions. In essentially the past few years, when faced with rule of law backsliding, we have had no more than a total of 5 lawsuits essentially dedicated to systemic violations of the rule of law. I mean, I have plenty of data, but essentially just to show you the extent of the Commission's inaction to some extent. 5 infringement actions compared to 50 requests from national judges from Poland under siege. So essentially, a lot of Polish judges have sent questions to the Court of Justice, resulting in 50 cases. So 5 infringement actions from the Commission, 50 cases from national judges. But because the situation has not improved, this has led to 500 complaints from Polish citizens, including Polish judges, being lodged with the Strasbourg court. So essentially, what we're looking at here is essentially it's a bit late for me, and I don't want to be rude, especially since people are listening online, so you never know. But essentially, what we can see is that the guardian of the treaty has failed to actually do the job. By essentially adopting a too little, too late mode of action or default setting. There's been some recent instances of possibly bold moves, but these are the exceptions. I believe this is essentially, this is no indication of what may happen in the next decade or so. In fact, I'm spending too much time on the toolbox decade. But I have plenty of examples to show you the full extent of essentially the EU's inaction, procrastination, and in some instances, actually complicity with those destroying or dismantling the rule of law. So much so that perhaps just to give you an example of how much or out of control the situation has become, out of desperation for the very first time last year, the Commission and the Council have been sued by European judges for violating the rule of law case law of the Court of Justice. This has never been done in the history of the rule of law in EU law. And this is essentially, I think, a damning indictment of the EU's institution failure to cope or deal properly and meaningfully and promptly with rule of law backsliding. And I can share with you another litigation, which is not in the news yet, but will be in the news, I suppose, either later this week or next week. The Commission, the von der Leyen Commission's legacy is going to be the following: to have been sued not once, but twice by association of judges for failing to defend the rule of law. It's unprecedented. So yes, we have seen freezing of EU funds, but at the same time, in a rather schizophrenic way, we have seen the worst violations of the rule of law committed by the guardian of the treaty and the Council. So, I mean, there are political explanations for this, what seems to be a schizophrenic response to democratic and rule of law backsliding. And this new litigation is actually coming from Romania. So we have essentially Romanian judges. I'm not saying the litigation will be won, but symbolically it's quite something. And Romanian judges, or an association of Romanian judges, has decided to sue the Commission for ending a specific rule of law tool in respect of Romania on what we think are not rational, at least on grounds which do not survive judicial scrutiny. So essentially, because I spend most of my time on the toolbox decade, but what can we expect next in terms of the future of the rule of law? I would say, I don't want to sound very bleak, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to be. I expect essentially that the EU is going to stop adopting new tools. So this is the end. What I expect to see in the next 10 years is essentially a period of retrenchment. So what do I mean by that? The EU is going to stop adopting tools because, I mean, it's no longer credible to spend more time negotiating, discussing tools. What I'm seeing, however, I'm seeing the first sign that essentially the Commission and the Council are giving up on enforcement tools. So even though there's been an attempt of remedying rule of law backsliding through the freezing of funds, seems to me that this is now seen as not effective either. So, and essentially, I believe that the temptation is that for the EU Commission and the Council to hide their failure and the lack of resolve by essentially seeking refuge in the recurrent production of reports and recommendations. So the next decade is going to be the reporting / recommendation decades. So we're going to move away from enforcement. And at the same time, while we're going to see more and more reports, more and more non-binding recommendations being produced, what I'm predicting is that at the same time, to hide the previous failure, essentially, I'm seeing already signs of normalizing what would have seen as blatant, manifest, shocking violations of the rule of law. So we're going to oscillate between the denial and normalization of what would have been essentially seen before or now, until now, as systemic violations of the rule of law. But I believe it's going to get even worse than this. It's not simply that the EU is going to stop enforcing or going after systemic violations of the rule of law. I think the EU itself might be tempted to also disregard the rule of law. I'm seeing more and more signs of what I call a new nonchalant attitude to the rule of law. So essentially, this is possibly, that could be a better name for what I expect to be the next 10 years in the history of the rule of law, the nonchalant decade. Essentially, what I'm saying is that we have those systematically violating the rule of law, but even in the pro-rule of law country, there's something new happening, which is not as noticeable because we tend to focus on the systemic threats to or violations of the rule of law. I'm seeing a kind of a nonchalant disregard to the rule of law whenever politically convenient. And let me give you just a recent example. Actually, I was reading a few days ago. I can multiply the number of examples. But the French government, for the very first time, a few days ago, ignored an interim order of the European Court of Human Rights, just point blank violated the interim order and surrendered someone who was surrendered to actually Russia, was suspended by the European Court of Human Rights. Simply, and they ignore also the fact that there was a pending application pending before the relevant French administrative court. Point blank disregard of the European Court of Human Rights. Obviously, this is great news for those engaged in systemic violations of the rule of law because this does provide them with a cover to do so. But it gets worse. We can see also examples of the EU institutions being tempted to systematically disregard their rule of law obligation, especially in an external action context. Here I'm referring to the work by Professor Kochenov, Professor Ganti about the EU lawless law. Yes. And just to give you an example, I would just refer you to the EU-Tunisia memorandum or agreement regarding migrants. So essentially what I'm saying is we're going to continue with systemic threats to and violations of the rule of law. And at the same time, we're going to see in what used to be pro-rule of law countries, or at least consolidated democracy, we're seeing more and more examples of a nonchalant attitude to the rule of law, and essentially where it has become simply something not even to mention when you disregard the judgments and orders of your own courts or courts of European courts. But because I think my time is up, essentially, what can we do about it? Essentially, we cannot expect EU institutions to defend the rule of law on their own and of their own motion. So we have to find ways of increasing the cost of inaction, not only at the EU level, but also the cost of disregarding the rule of law at the national level. So it's not easy to do so. I mean, some of us have been trying strategic litigation, but this is really out of desperation since no other channel seems to be working. It's also important, I think, perhaps to do what some of John's students are doing, which is also engaging the public about the importance of the rule of law, what is at stake when the system is no longer subject to rule of law constraints. And then I suppose there is also a lot of work about educating political actors as regards what has been described, I like this expression, their ecological responsibility to the democratic system in which they operate. So we need to convince political actors that the rule of law is not something you can use as a bargaining chip just because you're going to get positive headline the following morning. They need to be more mindful of their long-term ethical duties toward the system in which they operate. I would say, however, that we should not have any hope of changing this or making I would say perhaps let me backtrack quickly. I would say, however, it's no point thinking that this can be solved by new tools. And I think also it's not worth for limited resources and time to think that this can be changed through treaty reform. I would not spend any time at all discussing treaty reform, if only because actually there was a point made by Kim. You can only revise the EU treaty framework through unanimity. And I mean, asking Hungary to vote for for pro-rule of law improvements to the treaty framework, I mean, that's just a futile exercise. But essentially, I didn't want to end on a quite pessimistic note, but perhaps Kim can give us a more optimistic take on what might happen in the next decade. But I expect essentially the EU now to prioritize reports and recommendation of a non-binding nature, because then it's actually easier to feel pleased with yourself. And then you're going simply to minimize or accept what used to be unacceptable, and then hope that people no longer pay attention to what you're not doing and what you're supposed to be doing instead. So thank you very much.
So we will open for questions. So if you want to raise a question, if you can also introduce yourself.
We also do therapy, so if you want to just bemoan the state of things, we're happy to address that as well.
Both of you, what did you find out that surprised you the most, that you didn't expect? And second question, the opposite. Is there something that you wanted to find out that you still haven't gotten an answer to?
Such a good question.
Please speak up. It's in the back, it's hard to hear.
Yeah, Laurent, do you want to start?
No, it's a difficult question, so I would rather have you try to answer the question.
I said to both of you.
True, so you have to think of something. So, I kind of backed into studying the EU because mostly I was studying the transitions after '89 in Eastern Europe. I mean, I worked in Hungary at the Constitutional Court for a number of years. Then I worked at Russia. This was in Russia. That was when everybody thought things were getting better, right? And I'm sort of an American optimist in this regard. And when Hungary started going down the drain and it became impossible, it was really impossible after 2013. All the power was locked in. So there was nothing you could do inside the country. So I backed into studying the EU because I thought, oh, the EU should be able to do something about this. I said, not knowing much about the EU. So what I expected to find was alarm that there was a non-democratic member state in their midst. And I was surprised. It wasn't that they were ignorant, actually. I mean, I was talking at that stage to very high level people in the commission. They knew. They felt it wasn't their business to do anything about it. And they didn't see how the systemic consequences that would result from one state going bad. And that was before Poland, right? So I guess what surprised me was that I walk into a room with my hair on fire and people say, what a nice hairstyle, right? It was surprising to me that the EU didn't see the crisis coming or didn't see what was happening as a crisis, right? So that's and so then the flip side of that was, what did I find that I didn't expect? Then what should we have found that wasn't there? So what's been actually hopeful about this, and the reason why I'm much less pessimistic than Laurent, is that the Court of Justice is got, foot to the floor on inventing new doctrine almost every day to deal with this problem. And the president of the court, this conference where both he and I spoke and then had our papers produced in this volume, I mean, he's been speaking all over the place, saying things about this in ways that you wouldn't expect the president of a court to say, right? So the court is completely on it. They're finding all kinds of creative ways to develop tools. So you don't need the political branches, so to speak, to take the plunge if you can just get entities to follow the court decisions. Or actually, first, if you can get the cases to the court, that's the first problem. And second of all, if you can get the decisions enforced. So that makes me optimistic because then you're sort of in technocratic land, right? You can go into people and say, there is this judgment of a court, what are you doing to enforce it? And you're not in the, oh, you politically disagree with me box, right? Which is what I'm always in when I criticize Hungary. You're in a different space. And I am more confident that that space will win in more settings than the purely straight up political arguments. So I think what's being invoked now is the technocratic side or the legalistic in the good sense side of the EU. And I do think you can make more progress that way, but that's just because I'm a law professor most of the time. So it could just be that now they're speaking my language, so I think they've heard me. But I do think that's hopeful.
Yeah, I would not share this optimism. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with the pro-rule of law tendency within the case law of the Court of Justice, but it's very difficult to actually get access to the court. And essentially, if you're an autocrat, it's quite great to be in the EU because you can expect the EU not to do anything while you are dismantling democracy and the rule of law, because essentially only the Commission and the member states essentially can bring lawsuits to the Court of Justice. The only thing you need to do is to scare you national judges enough so that they don't actually send cases to the European Court of Justice, and then happy days, no one can already legally challenge you. And even if you get judgments against you, you can expect actually the Commission not to do anything about you violating the judgments. I have to oversimplify. You asked me what has surprised me the most, possibly having studied rule of law, having followed rule of law backsliding. What has surprised me the most is the creativity of those who could do something about it, finding always new excuses not to do anything about it. So I always been actually quite, not in a positive way, impressed by the creativity of those with the power to do it, to justify their inaction. So they're always very creative when it comes not only to essentially explain to you why they cannot use tools or why they're lacking the tools, when in fact a lot could have been done early on if there had been some political will. But it's not simply the politicians who I would blame for this. There is also, let's say, in the EU, there's been a legal culture which essentially actually goes against thinking outside the box. So you're actually being rewarded. The system has been wrongly designed to the extent that the system is rewarding safe legal actions rather, but you don't need safe legal actions when dealing with backsliding. You need to think outside the box. We have wasted a lot of time to get to that point. So sadly, I would say, obviously we can criticize the politicians a lot, but lawyers could have done possibly a better job. And it's difficult to generalize, actually. A lot of lawyers were creative within the EU institutions, but I would say at the senior level, there's been a lot of pushback against being creative. What I surprised possibly also in a negative way, I've never thought I will see the day of a commission deliberately violating the rule of law judgments of the Court of Justice for political or geopolitical reasons. And I'm talking here about the endorsement of Poland's recovery plan in 2022, which is why actually we were able, where European judges were essentially said enough is enough. We're going for the very first time sue the Council and the Commission on this basis. It may well be that because of legal standing issues, the legal actions are not going to survive essentially scrutiny in Luxembourg, but this in of itself is quite the indictment of EU as regards rule of law backsliding.
So if I may ask a question,
Sure.
since Kim mentioned sort of, right, the problem is, in a way, at the root of the problem are Hungarian elections, right? If we can only fix that, then we're going to fix sort of, right, the Hungary problem that Europe has.
Yeah.
And one thing that you have not mentioned is that sort of, right, that Orban's sort of super majority or high majority is based on the 2 million votes, Hungarian votes that he gets outside of Hungary in Romania. Okay, through very dubious kind of processes, right, with bags of kind of votes just being kind of, you know, collected and handed over. But that is a sort of, right, a space outside of Hungary where kind of, you know, Europe can operate and it can monitor the sort of votes and it can monitor the electoral process, right? And I just mentioned that this is something that is not on the slides, and sort of, right, in the spirit of your comment, Laurent, this is something where kind of political imagination and action is kind of, you know, needed and sort of possible. And I'm wondering sort of, right, and what can be done, and I'm not a legal expert, what can be done about sort of even this kind of whole problem? What can the Romanian government do about sort of the 2 million Hungarians that vote both in Hungarian and Romanian elections? And one could kind of, in fact, sort of maybe require them, I don't know if this is legally possible, right, just to choose one, not have both. And that would at least take away sort of, right, I mean, we're talking about 2 million votes here, right, out of, you know, what is the total number of votes in Hungary?
Yeah,
But like,
well,
you know,
there's 5. Actually, it's
yes,
closer
right?
to 1
So
million
this is a
total, but
really
out of
big,
5,
to me,
that's a
this
lot.
kind of, you know, I mean, if you want to
Yeah.
solve sort of, right, electorally, and sort of if that the root of it is sort of this electoral process that will sort of, right, in the long-term future, right, not generate a different majority, that is there a way to attack it through sort of, right, political means? And what can be kind of done? And sort of, since you both work with NGOs in kind of in the region, so right, what can be done kind of in the region?
Okay, so I made the democracy problem sound simpler than it is. Okay, so the first problem is that the EU has jurisdiction over things the member states have allowed it to have jurisdiction over. And it has no jurisdiction over national elections, strictly speaking, like narrowly speaking. That's been the first line of thing is, well, however, because, you know, I mean, every country is at their worst in their election laws, right? Because it's always the incumbents who write it. There's no such thing as a perfectly clean, fair election system. There are better ones and worse ones, but they're all terrible in some way, right? Like the German one, we were talking before about the German system, the German Constitutional Court had started 12 years ago, 15 years ago, saying the German system violated the German Constitution, and it took this long and a dubious parliamentary move to try to fix it. So it's an area where lots of member states have problems. Nothing like Hungary, okay, but once you start down the road, then then you have a problem over here. And okay, so first problem was just European jurisdiction. So where Europe does have jurisdiction, so there's the easy answer. So where Europe does have jurisdiction is in the elections to the European Parliament. And increasingly and of course, also in local elections where EU citizens are by European law allowed to vote. And so those two elections are the ones that Europe can clearly scrutinize. So Orban, recognizing this problem, amended the constitution last year so that now the local elections will be on the same day as European elections, just to get it out of the way and have this one little spot where they can act like model Democrats for like 2 months and then go back to what they've done. That was it was clearly designed to evade EU scrutiny. What it does, however, is it puts the political parties in a mess because the local elections are all first past the post, where the opposition parties all have to work together to have a chance of winning any of these local elections. But in the European elections, they all run separately because it's a proportional representation system. So I don't know what the parties are going to do to be together over here on one side of the ballot. And anyway, so he wanted to trip them up. So that was, okay. So the argument I was making, if you follow it through to its more radical conclusion, is that Article 10 of the Treaty of European Union requires member states to hold democratic elections for their national governments. Okay, so this is when I'm looking, because Dimitri's been one of my partners in crime on this. I keep mentioning things like this in the EU law context, and then Dimitri's been my fan and supporter on this, but many senior EU law scholars would look at me and say, well, you just don't understand how this works. Like, that will never work. And so we started a number of years ago with the national elections must be democratic. And then it's like, that's not an EU competence. And then actually John has been terrific because he's been working on the aspect of media. Like if you have an echo chamber media for all your elections, then they can't be free and fair if you're only getting the government's message, right? And media pluralism is increasingly an EU competence. So that's one kind of thing. Another way in is that all of the national parties in the member states belong to Euro parties, so when you vote for Fidesz in a Hungarian election, for most of the time Orbán's been in power, you were voting for the European People's Party at European level because they were associated. So now they've been thrown out. But again, most of the time when you vote in national elections or in European elections, you have no idea what party, the domestic party you voted for is hooked up with at transnational level. But there are some regulations about the transnational parties, which among other things would, and again, I think John's done more work on this, would tend to exclude national parties that don't uphold European values. So you can possibly get at it through the parties. Now, what I'm proposing is a frontal assault, right? Is saying in order to actually be a member of good standing in the European Union, in order to have your votes count in the council, you have to have had democratic national elections. I'm missing all the sophisticated EU lawyers do things like, well, let's get at it through media pluralism and through the Euro parties and and I'm just saying, let's just do Article 10, right? And the Court of Justice, which really does see the problem, has now been feeding us ammunition to go straight in on are the elections democratic? And so I'm hopeful that if we can figure out how to get the right case to the court. And this is again the problem. Getting to the Court of Justice is really hard. They've built a little moat around them so that they can only be approached by the EU institutions, by states, and by national judges. So the only way is to tee up a case to a national judge that's willing to take the political risk to refer the question. And so anyway, so it's hard. It should be easy, okay? But because of the limitation on EU competencies, particularly in this area, it's taken us this long to get there. Sorry, that was a long answer.
But there is one exception to the lack of jurisdiction, which is Article 7. It applies across the board. So there's nothing on paper, at least, preventing the council from just essentially telling the Hungarian government how to rewrite electoral law in Hungary. They can ask them to redo complete. They can ask them just to adopt all the international recommendations which have been made over the years. And you don't even need unanimity for this. I mean, the recommendations will not be essentially, they would be binding to some extent, but not violating them would not lead to automatic legal consequences.
I just thought, every once in a while when I'm on these panels, like a light bulb goes off in my head. So I just had a light bulb. So I told you that, the Polish elections happened and the opposition won. They've even got a coalition agreement. They're not in power yet. And they're not in power because of a bunch of domestic rules about how you form a government. And they have until the end of next week. This current government, which was sworn in, that doesn't have a majority in parliament, they're still the government. And they're the government through next week. What is next week? The European Council meeting, at which Hungary is going to threaten to veto everything. They could at that meeting just say Article 7, we're all going to vote. I mean, they don't even need a preparatory. They got plenty of preparation. They could just vote Hungary not having a vote, except that Poland's going to be at that meeting with the old government. It just occurred to me that was one of the big reasons why they wanted to hold out. Because there's a whole bunch of things coming to a head at that UCO meeting, and then it's election season, and the whole commission and everything dissolves if it's not resolved next weekend. And this is the first time it hit me. That was the reason for the Polish government to stay in power, right? To veto everything that would have come back to bite them if they ever come into power again. Just occurred to me.
Let's go ahead. Yes. And if you could tell us your name.
It's really a question of a course or
Partner in crime.
And my question could be provocative, probably. Is the EU on our side?
Yeah.
I wonder what is the approach to the rule of law that the EU institutions are actually espousing. And here I agree, it's difficult to get to the Court of Justice, but not if you are a fake judge. because there is a red carpet for the fake judges from Poland, and there is a special doctrine. Of course, the Court of Justice is very inventive, but it's not very inventive in terms of defending the rule of law as we, I think, understand it. But in order to find ways to not to be bound by the European Court of Human Rights in giving the fake judges an additional say. And then in order not to create any change on the ground, but in order to defend its own supremacy doctrine, not in order not to empower the Commission, but in order to empower the EU as a separate body as opposed to the member states. So I think on this count, and this is a totally different story probably compared with what both of you told. It overlaps in part with the story of what is to expect that Laurent presented, but in a way, I think, should we not start speaking about the EU as a third party in this dialogue between us scholars and the member states that are backsliding? And then shouldn't we start assessing the EU as a potential enemy, actually, of what we value as democratic and rule of law bound? And my very last point, this EU lawlessness law. There is a lot of stuff that the Commission is funding, that the Commission is doing, in full agreement with all the member states, Western and Eastern, Southern and Northern, that leads to a lot of crime, which nobody is accountable for. The 25,000 deaths in the Mediterranean over the last 7 years, it's a big deal. It's much more than, it's triple the number of Ukrainians dead as a result of Putin's aggression. And it's also hundreds of millions of our money. I mean, Europeans in the room who pay taxes in Europe. This is something is done as a result of the use of the EU by all the governments as a smokescreen against any kind of accountability. So the EU is a way to abuse power, and EU's rule of law, the one defended by Baron Lennox, the president of the court, is precisely the rule of law which is not on our side. Would you agree?
So as a often law professor, if you teach property law in the United States, you start on the first class by saying property rights are like a bundle of sticks. That's the metaphor. You have the right to use, if you own something, you have the right to use it. You have the right to alienate it. You have the right to alter it. And then it turns out in the whole property course, you show how each of the sticks has like a different story about it, okay? So like the EU is a bundle of sticks, right? And it's a bundle of issue areas, some of which, like immigration, it is made a total hash of. And there's nothing good to be said about anything about immigration policy in the EU. That's just a black hole, legal black hole. And then there's some other areas, like single market, enforcing, national non-discrimination in single market law, where they are absolutely excellent on the rule of law, right? So it's like the bundle of sticks, like you take this thing and you disaggregate it into a bunch of separate issue areas, policy areas, and I might add institutions. The Court of Justice is great on rule of law and increasingly democracy when it applies to the member states. And it is not so great at looking at that when it applies to EU institutions. Okay, so we're working with a body of institutions that is like this bundle of sticks. And, and the EU is as unintegrated as a bundle of sticks, which is to say the fact they've done something good over here has absolutely no spillover effect over there. It's a bunch of silos of policy areas, and it's a bunch of institutions which act in their interests first and foremost, and sometimes on behalf of the union at other times. So, essentially what you do when you work in the EU policy space is that you're constantly looking for the good sticks, it's like you're looking for the ones that are likely to be hopeful. And then you try to convince them that this stick actually works over there also, right? And so essentially what I see this rule of law activity that all of us have been engaged in doing is trying to find the good sticks and knit them together into a life raft. Maybe it will save migrants sometime, but it's sort of trying to at least save democracies in the EU. And then we need to work on everything else the EU has some nasty role in, right? So, I mean, at some level, national governments are much the same, right? I mean, Certainly in the US, you know, some of us used to love the courts. Now we only like state courts, the ones, you know, or Congress sometimes rises to the occasion and usually doesn't, but occasionally then you get, I mean, basically all governments are a bunch of pieces that disappoint you always. But if you actually just give in to the disappointment, then, you know, what are we doing? I mean, so it does seem to me that we need to try to do what we can. You know, at some level, just looking at EU law now and the EU institutions now compared to when Hungary started on this path, at least with regard to this backsliding problem, we are in a totally different world than we were 13 years ago in ways that could not have been imagined then. In ways where, you know, I walk in and I say all these things where the EU law experts say, well, you can't say that, you know, and now it's like, it's in all the textbooks as what you say, right? So that you have to make it, you have to create it. So I guess, you know, are things good? No. But what else can we do? Right, so I keep thinking the EU at least gives us this possibility. It has been responsive to all this effort. And, you know, we're just in a better place than we were, even if we haven't fixed the problem. So I don't know, maybe I'm just too much of an American optimist. And, you know, like I work on Hungary where, you know, everybody, the way I loved Hungary, the favorite children's book is Winnie the Pooh, translated as Mitzi Moscow. But it wasn't a translation, they completely rewrote it. It was Hungary's great poet of the 1920s, this guy Karinti, who rewrote it in verse. And the main character in the Hungarian version turns out to be Eeyore. Because everybody in Hungary is just depressed all the time, right? Oh, the donkey, like everything's worse. And Eeyore was my favorite character. He's called Füles in Hungarian. And I keep thinking, you know, like in the same book that has Eeyore, right? There's also Pooh, right? So like maybe we'll switch favorite characters in this novel someday, but you know, and in the meantime, there's a lot of Füles out there. The Eeyore. Sorry for the metaphor.
Can I add this? Excellent. I actually wanted to challenge maybe this metaphor of the sticks, and I was wondering whether we should incorporate more to a domino game, where basically migration is the first piece. And this is actually my question: to what extent what's happening now in the migration, not only at EU level, but at national level, it's actually a kind of a barometer of this rule of law backsliding, because now you see in so-called democracy, France, Belgium, etc., because you were mentioning, Laurent, the example in France, but in Belgium, you have also a very important judgment by the European Court on Human Rights, and the government just ignore it regarding migrants' treatment. And I really think that what we are seeing now, like regarding because I think here the European Court of Justice is a high priest of lawless law when it comes to migration and what's happening at EU border. And I think that maybe rule of law scholars have really to maybe focus on this issue of migration. I remember when I was working at the bar, there was a very prominent human rights lawyer saying, look at the treatment of migrants and you will know your next treatment to your citizens. And I think there is something very true in what's happening now in migration issues. And so I wonder to what extent we can separate and see everything as this rather than actually a domino games, and that this migration issue, which is an issue in every single EU member states, and like, there are so many governments like just who like obviously like violate the rule of law and the basics here. So I'm kind of more like the pessimist person here, saying like basically the treatment to migrants, which is getting worse and worse and worse. And what you were describing, Laurent, that probably like the next year, like we will see like this rule of law backsliding also at the EU level. And we see the example, for instance, the Netherlands, like why did they lose the election? It's also because they use this populist kind of a discourse regarding migrants as well. And so I think that migration really crystallized something like much more important. I think that's maybe we believe or we tend to see. But yeah.
No, I mean, essentially, I don't disagree. I mean, I would tend to, what I'm saying, which is something new, actually, which is why perhaps I was a bit pessimistic, is that a few years ago, essentially, everyone was at least in some sort of agreement that you needed to focus and deal with systemic threats to or violations of the rule of law. But what I'm seeing now is essentially the systemic threats or violations of the rule of law are still with us, But what's worse is that we're seeing now increasing non-compliance with judgments almost everywhere. So I'm not saying that whenever the French government or the Belgian government is regarding judgments, it does so in a systemic way. But actually what I'm saying is that the rule of law culture in Europe is being corrupted. And in fact, what I'm saying is that the autocratic tendency, rather than being remedied and dealt with, are contaminating the rest of the system in terms of how the law is considered. So we have adopting a more instrumental view of the law, and essentially now people said, no, we're only going to comply with our legal obligation when it suits us. This is this new attitude, which perhaps I'm finding more worrying. And this is perhaps why I was a bit pessimistic, but also I've been up since 4 o'clock this morning, so I tend to be quite grumpy after 12 hours work.
Can I just say one quick thing about this? So asylum is going to be, or the migrant problem is going to be the worst place to do this. And I don't want to be too formalistic about this, but legally speaking, the EU doesn't control immigration. It only controls asylum. And it may award temporary protected status, okay? But immigration policy is still member state policy. They've never given it up to the EU, right? It's the classic case of what do member states hang on to. So the EU doesn't control the whole policy space. I'm not making any excuse for what Frontex is doing. This is border stuff. But here's the bigger problem, which is this is a problem everywhere in the world, in part because the problem of migration has outgrown the legal framework internationally and domestically that is applied to it. Asylum law was created in the wake of basically the Second World War, when the people who were seeking asylum because they were personally being singled out for persecution on the basis of, and then you can read the Geneva Convention and all of the subsequent laws for specific reasons. Now people are moving en masse because situations have become intolerable in parts of the world, either because of war or climate crisis or government collapse or a whole bunch of other things. And the asylum law is not drafted to cope with that when you have mass migration for reasons other than being personally singled out. In fact, the asylum law is the opposite of that. It means you're different from everybody else in your community because you're being singled out. Instead of your whole community is moving, asylum law doesn't work. So the asylum framework is broken, and that's what the EU controls, okay? It's not an excuse, it's just saying, I think one way to fix the problem is to start rethinking what would it take to actually develop an adequate legal framework to the kinds of mass movements that we're seeing. And that would allow for the equitable distribution of people who are really desperate and seeking better lives in places that have the clear capacity and actually the need for them. So I think what we're seeing, and it's producing deaths, this policy, but it's producing deaths not just out of malfeasance, it's also producing deaths out of a lack of jurisdiction over the kinds of things that would fix it. So, you just do humanitarian stuff would be the obvious thing. And that's what member states should do. And the fact that we have far-right governments coming to power, starting with Hungary, but all along the border through which migrants travel, this is the Italian problem and so on, has meant that it's been impossible to get these fixes, So one thing I think we could spend a lot of time on is thinking generally for the world and not just in the context of the EU, is like, what's the legal framework that should replace the asylum framework for thinking about the kinds of movements of peoples that we're seeing? Because only if there's an adequate legal framework are you going to be able to use something like the rule of law as a way of controlling the problem. Otherwise, you're just doing pure humanitarianism, which we should obviously do more of, but which is frankly not the EU specialty, although it should do better, right? So anyway, I guess I'm just thinking that, it's just when you look at what the legal tools are that the EU has for dealing with it, maybe what we need is a decade of better tools, not just tools, but also actions, So this is the hardest problem in every legal system. So it's not just the EU, and I don't want to let them off the hook, but I also want to say that the problem's bigger than them. And the law is partly the the problem here, that the legal framework is not adequate to the problems we face.
So we're running out of time,
Sorry.
but we
Oh,
have
sorry.
one final question.
yeah.
If you can state it quickly. and
Yeah,
then-
sorry.
I'm not sure if it's a question as much as it's a piggyback on what Sarah was saying with respect to asylum, borders, and migration. I think what that exposes, and I guess this is a bit of pushback to both presentations, is what I think is missing in this conversation is a more informed discussion about human rights and how that factors into the values. Because what you see with asylum, borders, and migration, and especially the in and out and who's in and who's not, is that we're conflating the discussion in terms of civil and political rights and then economic, social, and cultural capacity of member states. And the fact that we're not having that discussion allows for populist movements and whatnot to oversimplify the debate to something there's an either or going on, a false binary, which I've spoken about way too many times, which results, I think, in further backsliding and the dumbing down actually of the political discourse on these matters. And I think that's where the rule of law team of John and the students that are here today comes in perfect limelight. They take the center stage here, because I think what we should be focusing on is how to expose these complexities more in a more accessible way without dumbing it down. And I think the tech space, the digitalization, what we're doing with transparency on political advertising, the stuff that we're doing within the institutions right now on those topics might very well be that domino effect that we need in order to deal with asylum, borders, and migration, and then at large with fundamental rights questions and questions of rule of law and democracy.
Yeah, so I'll just say something quickly while Laurent's thinking. So absolutely, so the EU has made tremendous progress in going from a system that only enforced market rights to a system that now has a charter of fundamental rights that goes beyond that. It's still getting used to that, and it's not gone anywhere near social and economic rights because there is no agreement among member states on that point. And frankly, for that matter, neither has the European Court of Human Rights, because the convention was written when these were not considered legally enforceable rights. So again, we have a legal framework that covers some but not all of this stuff. And so the thing to do is advocacy to expand the legal framework, right, for doing all of this, including in member states, including at EU level. Right now, that legal framework isn't there. So it's hard to get them to enforce the thing that they don't yet do in terms of sort of, economic, social, cultural rights. That said, there's a lot more that could be done. So, the flip side of market rights are the distribution of market rights, right? I mean, there are all kinds of creative arguments that can be made within the frameworks that we currently have. And what I've seen in the last 10 years as the person who walks into the room and says, duh, why don't we enforce democracy? It's in the treaty, it's like, and then people say that's too naive, right? And then you just work out the legal arguments and you press them in publications and you press them, you get annoying, and like at every cocktail party, you buttonhole the person from the commission and give them a lecture on, I've been doing this for 10 years and, sometimes they run away from me now. But I mean, that's sort of one of the ways you make legal change is to figure out how do you fill in the spaces that are not yet filled in this imperfect structure that are the EU institutions. Sometimes you have better purchase at the European Court of Human Rights, but of course, they have much less enforcement capacity than the EU. So one of the things I've been trying to do, in the countries where I work, is to try to get the human rights organizations turned around to face EU law, which is where the heavy enforcement power is, and then try to figure out, so how do we improve that? And there's ways to do it. So, when you look at comparative constitutional law and the emergence of human rights, for example, many people have built the right to health out of the right to life. Because, and then from there to institutional health care, and then especially the Inter-American Court, the Colombian Constitutional Court, the South African Court, Global South courts have done this for years. So one thing to do is to import the way that they read social and economic liens back into the political and civil rights. And that kind of thing is happening, but it needs an infrastructure, right? So one thing scholars can do is try to build out that infrastructure. What would it look like to actually have, an obligation to care for people who are in need, which could be extended then to the asylum context? or whatever, but you gotta build the legal infrastructure and not just preach at the institutions, at which we were sort of doing at the beginning, and then realized they're clueless. They need to have the legal arguments handed to them. And then they might be able to do something. These asset freeze things were totally, I mean, we never thought they'd do it, right? And then suddenly, like, boom, last Christmas, it was like 110 billion euros frozen to Poland and almost 30 billion euros frozen to Hungary overnight. It was a decade-long campaign, but once they had the law, they did it. So, I guess I think you build up these things by, campaigning in the streets and trying to raise awareness and make everybody feel like there's something they should be doing that they're not doing. But then also the legal infrastructure of this stuff is crucial to getting institutions like the EU institutions to act.
I'm not going to try to answer the question on the substance, but I'm just going to make perhaps some potentially interesting point about what I tend to get from EU civil servants regarding controversial legal issues. And perhaps this is not widely known, but essentially all the EU institutions are internally divided on these EU value related issues. And we need to be mindful of what we can do to help the pro-EU value constituencies within the EU institutions. And what do I mean by that? We need to provide them with the intellectual, legal, or whatever ammunition you can provide with, so that they can be used in internal battles. So just to give you an example from the rule of law field, a lot of us have been spending a lot of time arguing that you can sue on the basis of a specific treaty provision. And this was a very intense legal battle within the legal services of the EU institutions. And I was told that what we write is being used internally to actually win legal battles within the EU institutions. So in fact, it's reassuring to some extent regarding the impact of scholarship. You may not be cited anywhere, and yet you may have been the key influence on changing the particular way a policy is implemented or a lawsuit is argued. So in your own field, perhaps you need, might be interesting to see whoever might be someone who could actually promote your ideas within the relevant EU institutions. And I have found very helpful to talk to lawyers within institutions, and so they can tell me the arguments they are facing whenever they want to change things. And then you provide them with ammunition that then they can use internally. Not everyone does that, especially because this type of legal scholarship is not necessarily cited, so you don't have any evidence of impact.
No metrics.
No metrics. But then it's at least you're going to be told that you have helped change at least something through your writing. So it's always reassuring in a way. So thank you.
So on this note, we want to thank so much the
Great.
speakers.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience. So, yeah, we need to change Hungarian election law, but